July 8, 1944. 0417 hours. Western approaches to Carpiquet Airfield, Normandy. A thin ground fog clung to the wheat stubble and the shattered hedges. The airfield lay less than a kilometer east, but the final stretch had become a killing zone shaped by German concrete. Each bunker covered the next. Every field of fire overlapped. The Canadian and British infantry assigned to the sector had spent the previous 48 hours fighting for meters. The smell of cordite and burned fuel settled into the wet earth and never lifted. The terrain forced units into narrow channels that the Germans understood with exact precision. Into this stalled advance moved Private Elias Vandenberg, a Dutch-born infantryman serving with a Canadian regiment, a quiet man whose farm experience had shaped the way he read ground. His officers knew him as competent and unflinching under pressure. They did not see what he saw in the land, the subtle rises, the shallow contours, the micro-hollows that told him where a line of sight would break. At dawn the assault troops waited in slit trenches and shell-made furrows that offered only temporary shelter. The primary objective was a German bunker placed behind 2 layers of wire and covered by an MG-42 firing lane that cut across 2 open fields. The bunker's embrasures were oriented to deny any simple flanking maneuver. German mortar teams timed their fire to strike anyone who lingered behind cover longer than 5 seconds. Standard doctrine pushed platoons forward through bounding movements supported by smoke. The ground here punished that plan. Smoke drifted sideways in the morning wind and opened gaps that exposed men in mid-sprint. The previous assaults had ended the same way. Machine gun bursts shredded the lead sections and forced withdrawal. Casualties mounted. Morale sagged. No one doubted the resolve of the defenders. They were veterans of the 12th SS Panzer Division with deep knowledge of fortified defense. Elias studied the field each time he passed through the company's forward holding line. To most men it looked flat and hostile. To him it looked familiar. He saw a shallow depression that ran diagonally across the wheat stubble for nearly 40 meters. It was an old water trough channel cut decades earlier by French farmers who had used a controlled slope to direct rainwater into a reservoir. War had erased most of the physical structure, but the trough remained visible to a trained eye as a faint line where moisture pooled. The soil there held a different density. The grass grew shorter. The channel had a depth of only 40 to 50 centimeters, not enough to hide a standing man. To Elias it was enough to hide a crawling one. The angle of the trough intersected the right edge of the German bunker's firing sector. That line formed a natural blind spot. Anyone hugging that channel could move without crossing the bunker's direct line of fire. It was narrow and risky. A single German scout on the roof would compromise it. Yet in a battlefield where every conventional plan had led to dead men, this trough offered a path with a measurable chance of success. He approached his platoon commander during an after-action review. The officer listened with tired patience. Officers in this sector received dozens of suggestions after each failed advance. Most were fueled by frustration. Elias described the depression, the angle, the blind zone, and the specific elevation drop near the hedgerow at the far end. The commander shook his head. He said the ditch was too shallow, too exposed, and too reliant on the Germans failing to look at the exact right moment. He reminded Elias that doctrine avoided single-file approaches and suspected machine gun arcs. One well-placed burst could cut down an entire team crawling in tight formation. Elias understood the concern. He tried again. He said that no other approach would work against this position and that even a partial crawl would bring them far closer than any previous attempt. The officer told him to drop it. The plan for the next assault rotation remained unchanged. Frustration spread through the ranks as the morning progressed. Artillery softened the position but could not achieve direct hits on the hardened bunker. Engineers failed to breach the wire under fire. German counterfire remained consistent. The airfield complex needed to be taken before the next day's operational window. The commander met with his senior NCOs and reviewed casualty reports. They showed a grim pattern. More men lost in the last 12 hours than the previous 2 days combined. He walked the edge of the forward line and surveyed the ground again. From that vantage the trough was faint but visible. He realized that Elias was not imagining it. It was there. It was stable. It offered at least partial cover from the bunker's primary embrasure. It also offered a diagonal path that no frontal assault had exploited. The officer called Elias over. He asked for specifics. Elias described the entry point, the estimated distance from the trough to the bunker, and the likely moment when the rising sun would silhouette anyone moving on the surface but leave the trough in shadow. The officer asked how far a man could crawl before being seen from a lateral German position. Elias gave precise estimates based on soil texture, grass height, and the reflection angle from pooled dew. The officer listened without interruption. When Elias finished, the officer approved a reconnaissance crawl by a 3-man team. This would not be a full assault. Its goal was simple: verify whether the trough provided the concealment Elias claimed. The crawl began at 0528 hours. Elias led 2 men, Corporal Hensley and Private Reese. Each carried minimal gear. Elias took a demolition charge wrapped tightly to reduce noise. They moved to the trough entrance under the cover of sporadic mortar fire that masked their low movement profile. Elias lowered himself first. The soil was damp. The channel walls pressed against his shoulders. He crawled using elbows and knees, minimizing any change in silhouette. The German bunker fired intermittently at suspected movement elsewhere along the front. The MG-42's tone shifted as it swept across open ground. Elias paused each time he heard the barrel change pitch. Machine gunners adjusted rhythm based on elevation and recoil patterns. Elias tracked those patterns and timed his breathing around them. 20 meters in, the trough dipped by another 10 centimeters. That dip created a dead zone that even a German sentry on top of the bunker would struggle to observe without leaning far over the parapet. Elias motioned for the others to keep distance. A single grenade blast in this confined space would kill all 3 if they bunched up. They pushed forward until they reached the point where the trough intersected the hedgerow. From here they could see the bunker's flank. They saw the embrasure firing lane. They saw the wire. They also saw that the Germans had not reinforced the blind corner. It was the one place the machine gun could not reach. Elias withdrew the team before they risked detection. The return crawl took twice as long. Each movement was measured. When they reached friendly lines, the officer met them with urgency. Elias confirmed the path worked. He said they could reach the bunker without alerting the crew if they moved at dawn when the sun produced the strongest shadow line. The officer nodded. He said they would plan a demolition run. The bunker would fall from its blind side. The plan moved fast because time was the only thing the battalion could not replace. Engineers provided Elias with 2 additional demolition charges, each fitted with short fuses to avoid long exposure at the bunker wall. A 3-section covering force prepared to suppress adjacent German positions the moment movement in the trough began. The medical teams waited behind a shattered barn where casualty evacuation routes had been mapped earlier in the day. The battalion intelligence officer briefed Elias on the likely internal layout of the bunker. The Germans used standardized Regelbau designs. This one matched a Type 667 with a forward-firing embrasure, a reinforced roof, and a rear entrance covered by an earth mound. Blowing the flank wall would disable the crew before they could escape or reorient their machine gun. Command emphasized that one successful breach would open a corridor for the left flank to advance toward the airfield's western taxiway. Elias studied the ground again with deliberate focus. He moved along the trough's entry point and memorized each contour. He paced the crawl distance in his mind. He noted where the soil grew softer and where puddles formed. The more he looked, the more confident he became that the trough offered the only surviving natural line of approach in this grid of ruins and craters. His 2 chosen teammates shared none of his experience with farming, but they trusted his judgment. They had seen the trough's concealment for themselves during the reconnaissance crawl. Their confidence now came from the most reliable battlefield currency, first-hand observation. By 0620 hours the battalion signaled readiness. Elias checked his equipment. He tightened the charges against his chest to reduce noise. He secured his entrenching tool so it would not clatter against stone. He adjusted his helmet straps to stop them from brushing against the trough wall. He drank water, slow and controlled, to keep his breathing steady. Every movement showed a man preparing for a task that demanded patience more than speed. The officers briefed him again. If the Germans detected the crawl early, he was to abandon the attempt and fall back. Every casualty already suffered in this sector weighed on command. They could not lose more men to a tactic they had approved with reluctance. At 0631 hours the covering force opened with precise fire. Riflemen targeted known observation slits. Machine gun crews fired at the secondary bunker to the south. Mortar teams launched rounds that bracketed the area without jeopardizing Elias's path. The suppression was not meant to destroy. It was meant to occupy the defender's eyes. Under this noise Elias slid into the trough. The first 10 meters went quickly. His elbows cut through wet soil. His breath stayed controlled. The sun rose behind him and cast a narrow shadow that aligned perfectly with the trough's depth. He crawled until the shadow line covered his entire body. Each pause matched the rhythm of the MG-42 as it searched across open ground. Corporal Hensley followed. He kept his head low and matched Elias's pace. Private Reese advanced next, maintaining a strict gap to avoid stacking bodies in one gully. The trough carried the sound of their movements forward, but the battlefield noise hid everything except sharp metallic sounds, which Elias avoided entirely. The Germans fired sporadically. None of their fire patterns indicated detection. The team reached the deeper dip that had concealed them during reconnaissance. Elias stopped. He listened. He waited. The MG-42 tone shifted as the gunner changed belts. Belt changes were precious windows. The gun crew focused entirely on reloading. Elias used the moment to crawl another 6 meters, closing the distance to the bunker's flank. The trough ended at the hedgerow. Beyond that point the team had to expose themselves for a few meters. Elias studied the angle again. The bunker's firing lane did not extend to its own wall. The blind spot formed a wedge of safety that started exactly 1 meter beyond the hedgerow. Elias whispered to Hensley and Reese. They would move one at a time, fast, low, and direct. Elias went first. He slipped out of the trough and into the grass. He hugged the earth. He counted each breath. He moved until he reached the bunker's concrete surface. The wall felt cold. The vibration from the machine gun inside traveled through the structure. He positioned the first charge at the corner where the concrete seam formed a weak point. He pressed it firmly and armed the fuse. Hensley reached him next. He delivered the second charge. Elias placed it near the first. Private Reese stayed at the hedgerow as rear security. His job was to prevent German patrols from surprising the demolition team. Elias checked the spacing of the charges. He needed both to detonate in close sequence to rupture the wall. He pulled the fuses. He signaled Hensley to fall back into the trough. He followed. They crawled backward with urgency. The fuses burned fast. 3 seconds. 2. 1. The explosion hit with a dense, concussive thud. A section of concrete tore outward. Dust and debris shot across the blind spot. Elias felt his ears ring. The bunker's machine gun fell silent. A second internal blast followed, likely from ammunition cooking off. Elias reached the deeper dip in the trough before the dust cloud lifted enough for Germans in nearby positions to understand what had happened. When the secondary bunker opened fire, its angle could not reach the trough. Elias and Hensley crawled with renewed speed. Private Reese provided the critical next step. As soon as the first explosion sounded, he stood from the hedgerow and fired on a German observer climbing from the bunker's roof hatch. The rifle shot forced the observer to retreat. That bought the team another few seconds. By the time the dust cleared, Allied covering units shifted fire to suppress any German counteraction. Mortars bracketed the secondary bunker. Riflemen advanced along the left flank. Engineers moved toward the breach to clear wire. Elias and his men reached friendly lines at 0647 hours. Their uniforms were soaked with mud. Their faces were coated in dust. They had no casualties. Command moved fast. Officers directed assault teams to exploit the breach. The destruction of the bunker destabilized the entire German defensive web in the sector. Communications between bunker crews faltered. Supporting fire from adjacent positions became irregular. The Germans, thinking the flank was compromised by a larger force, began to withdraw from exposed firing points. Commanders from nearby companies evacuated the wounded and pushed rifle squads into the newly opened corridor. The advance toward the western taxiway gained momentum. The breakthrough that had eluded them for 2 days now unfolded through a ditch that doctrine had written off as irrelevant. The trough that had once carried water across a farm field now carried men through a fortified line. Officers who had dismissed Elias's idea realized the tactical value of terrain knowledge that came from civilian life. Word spread across the battalion within minutes. Men repeated the story with precise detail. They spoke of a farmer who saw what others missed. They spoke of a shallow trough that defeated a class of fortification responsible for dozens of casualties. They spoke with respect because the battlefield respected results. The story traveled along the front faster than any formal report. Units preparing for their own assaults asked for descriptions of the trough's angle and depth. They wanted to know how a channel barely half a meter deep had delivered a victory where artillery and armor had failed. By midday, officers conducted a full inspection of the ruined bunker. The charges had torn through the flank wall with clean efficiency. The concrete showed stress fractures that indicated the seam was a natural weak point. Engineers noted that similar structures in the area had identical seams. The findings reshaped the next phase of planning. If a trough could deliver men to that seam undetected, then each bunker in the sector could be approached in a similar format. Command ordered reconnaissance teams to search for other micro-depressions in the terrain that could create blind spots. Elias stayed silent as officers discussed the next objectives. He avoided attention. He cared about the result, not the recognition. He cleaned his equipment, rewound his straps, and waited for the next assignment. His squad treated him with quiet respect. Soldiers did not need speeches. They needed solutions that saved lives. Elias had delivered one. The afternoon sun revealed details that the morning fog had hidden. Crater lips cast sharp shadows that showed elevation changes down to the smallest ridges. Officers led survey teams across the sector to locate terrain depressions similar to the trough Elias had used. These teams included infantrymen, engineers, and artillery observers. They checked each dip with uncompromising attention because every meter of concealed ground could reduce casualties in the next assault. For the first time since the offensive around Carpiquet began, the battalion felt momentum. The destruction of the flank bunker shifted the psychological balance. The Germans now operated with uncertainty. They had treated the bunker network as unbreakable. Seeing one obliterated through an unorthodox approach forced them to reconsider their assumptions. Elias watched the survey teams work. He noted how they moved through the field, eyes fixed on the ground. He recognized the same learning curve he had seen among new farmhands. Farmers learned to see land not as a surface but as a pattern of height, moisture, shade, and direction. Every bump means something. Every hollow tells a story about runoff and weight distribution. Elias understood these things intuitively. Yet he knew that without confirmation from the earlier crawl and the demolition run, no officer would have trusted such instinct. Battlefield skepticism was defensive logic. Lives depended on methods that could be repeated. Now that the trough tactic worked, officers wanted to study it. At 1,330 hours the battalion commander assembled platoon leaders for a tactical review near a shattered farmhouse. The roof had collapsed but the stone walls remained upright. They used the interior as a makeshift operations point. The commander emphasized 3 observations. First, small terrain features provided more concealment than previously assumed. Second, the German bunkers had fixed firing arcs that created predictable blind zones. Third, controlled approach routes could bypass hardened firing lines without using smoke, which meant reduced exposure during shifting wind. This was a decisive change because Carpiquet's environment often neutralized smoke through cross currents. The trough tactic restored predictability. The intelligence officer briefed aerial photographs taken 2 days prior. He said that shallow depressions were hard to detect from the air. Only ground-based examination revealed their actual depth. This made them valuable because the Germans rarely defended them with consistent attention. German doctrine focused on high ground, obvious cover, and main avenues of approach. Depressions like troughs, irrigation channels, drainage cuts, and livestock paths received less defensive weighting. When enemy doctrine overlooked something, the Allied units could exploit it. In mid-briefing the commander called Elias forward. He asked him to describe the trough in simple terms. Elias kept his voice steady. He explained that the trough followed a natural slope that once channeled water into a basin. He highlighted how the soil texture and vegetation difference exposed the old pattern. He said the trough was not unique. Farmers across Normandy had used similar systems for decades. The commander requested that Elias join the survey teams for the rest of the day. His ability to detect subtle depressions might refine the search before the next assault window. Elias agreed. He moved with a reconnaissance section to the northern edge of the sector where the next series of bunkers guarded the approach to the airfield's western taxiway. The terrain here was more complex. Heavy bombardment had erased many natural features. Yet some patterns persisted. Elias knelt at each depression and inspected the soil. He noted where the moisture lingered. He explained how a certain type of grass curved when exposed to repeated water flow. The reconnaissance NCO asked how much cover these lines offered. Elias said each depression required testing. Some were too shallow. Some opened toward German observation points. Some intersected fire lanes. They documented every viable route using chalk marks on collapsed walls and broken fence posts. While Elias worked, German artillery shelled the sector sporadically. Rounds fell without pattern. The Germans were probing for Allied concentrations. Their artillery observers had lost confidence in the accuracy of their earlier assumptions. Elias kept his movements low during each barrage. He watched how the falling rounds created new craters that changed terrain in real time. The battlefield was not static. Every shell reshaped the possibilities. In some cases a crater created a new depression that could serve as a crawl channel. In other cases the blast exposed the path and nullified its concealment. Elias adapted quickly. He marked each change in the reconnaissance notes. By 1600 hours, two viable approach routes emerged. One was a shallow drainage path that curved along the edge of a destroyed orchard. The second was a livestock trail that paralleled a series of collapsed outbuildings. Neither offered protection as complete as the original Trough. Both required precision timing and strict noise control. Officers debated which route to use for the next assault. They studied the distance to the nearest bunker and estimated the time required for a crawling team to reach its flank. They considered German counterfire angles. They mapped enemy movement patterns observed throughout the day. The planning staff realized that they could not rely on a single successful tactic. They needed a systematic method to identify and exploit all-terrain-based blind spots. Elias continued working with the teams until the sun dipped lower. The warmth faded. Shadows grew long. As light changed, the contours of the land changed with it. Depressions that were invisible at midday stood out under oblique light. Elias pointed out several more micro-hollows that no one had noticed earlier. The officers noted how his farming background offered an advantage. They observed how his eye for landforms exceeded standard military training. The commander ordered that Elias be included in the next day's briefing cycle. Back at the company position, Elias cleaned his equipment. Mud sealed the joints of his uniform and hardened at the knees. He washed his hands using water from a broken canteen. The men around him cleaned rifles, checked rations, and patched torn gear. They spoke quietly. War had stripped them of unnecessary speech. Each man processed the events of the morning. They had seen a fortified position destroyed with minimal losses. They had watched an unorthodox idea succeed. They had seen a farmer's terrain logic outperform conventional assault doctrine. These things mattered. Soldiers cared about anything that increased their chance of survival. After evening rations, the battalion circulated a written order. It acknowledged the demolition of the bunker and credited the tactic to reconnaissance of terrain depressions. It stated that all platoons were to survey their immediate sectors for similar features. It directed engineers to prepare demolition charges for flank breaches and subsequent operations. It emphasized that the results achieved near Carpiquet demonstrated the tactical advantage of exploiting subtle ground patterns. Soldiers read the order with careful attention. It was rare for command to endorse a tactic born in the ranks. Elias sat by a ruined wall as night approached. The field ahead flickered with occasional tracer fire. Allied units on the flanks exchanged periodic bursts with German patrols probing for gaps. Elias went through the crawl route in his mind again. He pictured the trough, the shadow, the angles. He thought of the charges detonating, the wall collapsing, the silence of the machine gun. He replayed each moment to understand what worked and what did not. He did not treat the tactic as victory. He treated it as a problem solved, a calculation proven under pressure. The next phase of the Carpiquet push would begin at dawn. Officers predicted heavier resistance because the Germans had now witnessed the vulnerability of their bunker network. The defenders would adapt. They would adjust their observation practices. They would reinforce blind spots. They would deploy more patrols. Elias knew this. Innovation rarely worked twice without modification. He concluded that the next breakthrough would require not only a depression in the ground but also a new application of timing, concealment, and angle. As darkness settled, the battalion reduced noise discipline. Men spoke in low tones. Radio men transmitted updates to adjacent units. Engineers prepared Bangalore torpedoes for wire cutting. The smell of burning ration cans drifted through the night air. Elias sat quiet and focused. He understood the responsibility that now fell on him. The officers would look to him at first light. They would expect him to interpret the ground again. He accepted that role. He knew the land better than he knew most people. He trusted terrain. It never lied. It never pretended. It revealed patterns to those who paid attention. On a battlefield shaped by steel and fire, the smallest detail in the earth could decide who lived and who did not. Night settled unevenly across the Carpiquet sector. Tracer lines cut through the dark at random intervals. Occasional flares rose from the German side, hung in the air, and faded into silence. The battalion rotated its sentries and reduced movement to prevent giving away new positions. Artillery farther west pounded German logistical routes, sending a steady vibration across the fields. Elias stayed awake longer than most. He studied the battlefield by moonlight because terrain always changed under different lighting. Faint depressions behaved differently when illuminated from the side. Shadows lengthened subtle ridges. The land became readable in new ways. At 2,320 hours a runner arrived with instructions. Elias was to report to the battalion command post for a late-night planning session. He walked carefully between crater rims and splintered beams. The command post occupied a partially collapsed cellar beneath a ruined farmhouse. Lanterns lit the interior. Maps were pinned against broken masonry. Officers stood around a long wooden table covered with aerial photographs, range measurements and enemy firing diagrams. They turned as Elias entered. The commander pointed to a marked location on the map. It showed the next bunker cluster guarding the western taxiway, a position the Germans had reinforced with overlapping arcs and intermittent MG outposts. The intelligence officer explained that the Germans had added more patrols along their perimeter after the morning's breach. They doubled their roof sentries and increased lateral observation. Any new approach route would face higher detection risk. Yet they still relied on fixed arcs. Those arcs could not cover every angle. The commander asked Elias whether any of the depressions he had surveyed earlier offered a stable enough line for a crawl approach similar to the first trough. Elias studied the map and thought about the orchard's drainage path and the livestock trail. He said both were viable if used with exact timing. The commander asked him to explain. Elias outlined the drainage path first. It curved gently around the southern edge of the orchard. Its depth varied from 20 to 50 centimeters. He said the deepest point lay behind a fallen apple tree trunk that created a visual obstruction. A crawling team could reach that point undetected. The second half of the path angled toward a blind zone near the bunker's secondary embrasure. The Germans rarely oriented fire in that direction because the terrain channeled assaults from the opposite side. The livestock trail offered a straighter route but had thinner cover. Elias said the trail should be used only as a secondary fallback, not a primary approach. Officers evaluated his analysis. They agreed that the drainage path provided the best chance. They reviewed fire patterns recorded over the past 2 days. They noted which German positions fired at night and which remained silent. They tracked observation points based on flare timing. After 30 minutes of review, the commander decided to conduct a demolition crawl at dawn using the drainage path. He appointed Elias to lead the team again. Elias accepted the assignment without hesitation. Soldiers rarely refused tasks once they saw a method that worked. The planning session ended at 0025 hours. Elias returned to his company position. He rested against a crater wall and closed his eyes. He slowed his breathing and rehearsed the route in his mind. He traced each curve. He visualized the crawl rhythm. He pictured the light conditions at dawn. Sleep came in short stretches. He woke at every distant explosion. By 0345 hours the sky began to lighten. The battalion prepared for movement. Units shifted into attack positions. Elias gathered Hensley and Reese. He briefed them on the new crawl route. He emphasized noise control and spacing. They checked their gear. They minimized anything that could scrape against stone. At 0512 hours the mortar teams began a controlled suppression sequence. They launched rounds that landed behind German observation posts to divert attention. Rifle squads opened harassing fire against the nearest outpost. The pattern replicated a standard Allied pre-assault routine, designed to prevent the Germans from suspecting an infiltration. Under this cover, Elias and his team moved to the mouth of the drainage path. The entrance was narrow, hidden behind a tangle of collapsed orchard branches. Elias slid inside first. The soil felt different from the trough. It was softer, looser, formed by years of water flowing from the orchard to the fields. The depression dipped quickly, creating a shallow trench that hugged the ground. Elias advanced with a smooth elbow crawl. His goal was to keep his silhouette flat enough that even a German sentry looking directly toward the orchard would not notice movement. Hensley followed 10 meters behind. Reese covered the rear again. The sun rose gradually, creating a low angle of light that flooded the orchard with diffuse illumination. Shadows stretched across the drainage path. Elias used those shadows to hide slight movements. He paused whenever he heard the subtle metallic click of an MG-42 adjusting elevation. He recognized these sounds after weeks of exposure. German gunners made small adjustments before firing bursts. Elias timed his stops to those adjustments. The drainage path curved left after 15 meters. At that bend lay the fallen apple tree. Its trunk had been sheared by artillery. Branches stretched outward, forming a natural screen. Elias crawled beneath them. He waited in the deepest part of the depression. He listened to the battlefield. Mortars boomed with deliberate pacing. German rifles cracked sporadically. The bunker's machine gun fired in controlled bursts toward a different sector. That confirmed Allied deception had worked. The Germans believed the main attack would come from the west, not the orchard. Elias signaled Hensley forward. They crawled toward the second half of the path. This section angled toward the bunker's blind zone. The soil here was firmer. Grass grew unevenly. Elias noticed evidence of livestock movement from before the war. Soil compaction patterns revealed where hooves had shaped the ground. These details mattered because they predicted where noise would be minimal. Hard-packed soil reduced scraping. Soft soil amplified it. Elias adjusted his crawl accordingly. He placed weight on his elbows rather than his knees when crossing softer patches. As they neared the bunker, the drainage path shallowed. Elias paused. He checked the light. The rising sun now cast a sharp line across the bunker's concrete. The blind zone remained intact because the bunker's embrasure pointed away from this direction. Elias whispered to Hensley. They would complete the final approach with a low rush. Reese stayed behind to hold the covering position. Elias moved first. He left the drainage path and hugged the grass. He advanced until he reached the bunker's flank. This bunker differed in structure from the earlier one. It had an additional ventilation shaft on the side. Elias studied the shaft. It provided a weak point. He placed the first charge at the base of the shaft. He pressed it against the concrete seam. Hensley arrived and passed him the second charge. Elias placed it slightly higher to ensure vertical fracture. He armed both fuses. The moment he pulled the fuses, he signaled Hensley to drop flat. They moved back into the depression at full speed while maintaining silence. The charges detonated with a powerful concussive force. The shaft collapsed inward. Concrete fragments scattered across the blind zone. Elias felt the shock wave through the soil. He did not stop. He crawled with urgency until he reached the orchard bend. German machine gunners reacted slower this time. The blind zone shielded the demolition team until they were well into the drainage path. Once rifle squads on the flanks saw the explosion, they advanced with coordinated fire. Reese held the rear position effectively. When two German soldiers attempted to investigate the orchard edge, he fired a controlled double shot that forced them to take cover. That bought Elias and Hensley time to reach safe depth. German mortars responded quickly. Several rounds landed near the orchard. Dirt and debris rained over the drainage path. Yet none of the rounds struck the depression directly. The team emerged from the orchard at 0539 hours. Their uniforms were soaked with mud again. Dust clouded their sleeves. But they were uninjured. The second demolition success sent immediate shock across German channels. Allied officers recognized the moment. They ordered an accelerated push along the left corridor. Engineers advanced with wire cutters. Infantry squads moved through the orchard ruins. The battalion seized momentum once more. The command post relayed the results across the brigade. Reports emphasized the tactics' precision. They highlighted the value of terrain depressions. They described how Elias's knowledge allowed the battalion to bypass 2 fortifications in a single day. The brigade commander directed all units to examine the surrounding terrain for similar routes. The Trough tactic was no longer an isolated success. It had become a repeatable method. Elias sat near a shattered wall as medics passed by with wounded from a different sector. He cleaned his equipment again. He checked for cracks in the fuse casings. He removed packed mud from his sleeves. He felt the weight of exhaustion begin to settle. Yet his mind stayed clear. He knew that the Germans would adapt again. He knew the next assault would require even more precision. The battlefield demanded constant adjustment. He prepared for what lay ahead. The destruction of the second bunker shifted the operational geometry across the entire western sector of Carpiquet. German officers now faced a pattern they could not ignore. Their fixed fortifications, once considered immovable anchors of defense, had been breached twice by a tactic that exploited subtle terrain depressions. Reports from intercepted German communications revealed frustration among bunker crews. They complained that the enemy had appeared from angles considered impossible. They blamed inadequate perimeter patrols and insufficient observation training. They feared that every hollow in the ground hid a possible infiltration route. This psychological disruption mattered as much as the physical breaches. Once defenders questioned the reliability of their own firing arcs, their confidence eroded. Allied command met at 0930 hours to consolidate the day's gains. Engineers marked cleared paths. Rifle squads secured newly captured positions. Mortar teams shifted their base plates to support deeper advances. The commander requested that Elias return to the command post. When Elias arrived, he saw more officers than before. A brigade-level liaison had joined the meeting. They wanted a full explanation of how the trough and drainage path tactics worked and why they succeeded. The liaison officer asked Elias to describe what he looked for in the terrain. Elias explained texture, moisture retention, shadow behavior at different times of day, and how small elevation changes affected visibility. He spoke plainly. He said that land told stories if one looked long enough. The officers listened with uncharacteristic patience. They had learned that ignoring unconventional insight cost lives. The liaison officer took notes and asked whether these terrain indicators could be taught quickly to reconnaissance teams. Elias said that with practice, yes, but some details required experience. He noted that farm labor teaches a person to judge microslopes because irrigation demands accurate water flow control. The commander asked Elias whether he could mentor a small group of scouts for the next phase of operations. Elias agreed. They selected 6 men from different platoons. He took them to the orchard and demonstrated how to read the ground. He pointed out small depressions. He explained which lines offered concealment and which were too shallow. He taught them to test soil firmness by pressing with the edge of their palms. The scouts absorbed his lessons with urgency. They understood the stakes. While Elias instructed the scouts, German artillery shelled the northern fields with renewed intensity. The blasts carved fresh craters, altering the terrain in real time. Elias walked to each new crater and studied the lip. He identified whether the blast created a usable depression or whether it exposed ground that had previously offered cover. He taught the scouts to do the same. They learned that artillery was as much a sculptor of the battlefield as a weapon. It created opportunities and removed them. The scouts began marking terrain in chalk and recording measurements. Officers reviewed these notes and integrated them into the next planning cycle. At midday, reconnaissance confirmed that the next bunker cluster was larger, reinforced, and integrated with an underground communication trench. The Germans had reacted. They repositioned an MG-42 team to watch the orchard side. They dug shallow listening posts near the livestock trail. They tightened patrol rotations. They adapted quickly. They understood that their blind spots had been exploited twice. They aimed to close every angle. Yet terrain remained imperfect. Even among reinforced defenses, small depressions persisted. Elias believed they could still find an approach. By 1400 hours, the scouts identified a new terrain feature. It lay north of the orchard and east of a shattered farmhouse. It was a broken livestock well run. Before the war, animals had followed this narrow line to reach a watering trough. Years of hoof traffic had carved a shallow channel into the earth. The well had collapsed early in the battle due to artillery strikes. The collapse created an irregular depression about half a meter deep at its lowest point. The channel extended 30 meters toward the bunker cluster. It bent twice, forming natural site breaks. The scouts brought Elias to examine it. He crouched beside the run and studied the soil. He confirmed the depth. He checked its orientation relative to the bunker's firing arc. It sat outside the main embrasures line. The Germans had placed their new observation post too far left. This created a new blind zone on the right flank. Elias reported the findings to the commander. Officers debated whether to attempt a third demolition run before nightfall or wait until dawn. They weighed German readiness, Allied fatigue, and the catch-in momentum. The brigade liaison said that a third success would collapse the entire defensive node and open the western taxiway fully. The commander decided they would move before sunset. The window was short. Light conditions would shift rapidly. That shift could either mask or expose movement. Elias studied the shadow lines again. As the sun dipped, long shadows formed behind crater lips and broken structures. He concluded that the livestock well run would be most concealed between 1710 and 1725 hours. After that, the angle would expose the crawl team. At 1635 hours, preparations began. Engineers issued new demolition charges. These charges had reinforced casing because the next bunker had thicker walls. Elias selected 2 men from the scout group to join Hensley. Reese would remain in a rear observation role. The commander briefed the covering forces. Mortars would fire a staggered pattern designed to pressure the German observation post without fully revealing the intended axis of attack. Machine gunners would suppress flanking positions. Rifle squads would prepare to surge forward once the bunker fell. At 1708 hours, the covering fire began. Elias and his team moved to the entrance of the livestock run. The depression started shallow. Elias slid into it and flattened his profile. He crawled with smooth, deliberate movements. The sun cast long stripes of shadow across the run. At each bend, Elias paused to listen. German sentries shouted to one another. The bunker's machine gun fired sporadically. None of the bursts came in their direction. The Germans focused on the orchard and the central corridor. They still expected the main attack from familiar angles. The livestock run deepened near a collapsed stone trough. Elias used that depth to accelerate slightly. He crossed the next 5 meters faster without raising his silhouette. Hensley followed, breathing controlled. The two scouts advanced with equal discipline. The soil in this run was compact at the base and loose at the edges. Elias positioned his elbows in the compact center to minimize noise. He recognized old hoof patterns etched into the ground. These had flattened the soil in ways that reduced scraping risk. He used them as a guide. The final bend brought Elias within 10 meters of the bunker. The flank wall sloped differently from the earlier structures. It had an angled reinforcement ridge. Elias signaled the team to halt. He studied the ridge. It created a pocket beneath it where charges could be placed for maximum concussive effect. He crawled the remaining distance with extreme caution. German footsteps echoed faintly from inside the bunker. The crew was alert but not oriented toward this flank. Elias placed the first charge under the ridge. He wedged it against the concrete. He positioned the second charge slightly forward. He armed the fuses. He whispered the order to fall back. They crawled fast. They hit the deepest part of the run just as the charges detonated. The blast tore the reinforcement ridge apart. A section of the flank wall split. Smoke and debris poured outward. German screams followed as the machine gun fell silent. Allied covering units surged. Mortars struck the observation post. Rifle squads advanced and secured the breach. Engineers followed with wire cutters. The entire bunker node collapsed within minutes. The western taxiway fell into Allied hands. The brigade signaled success across the division. Elias emerged from the livestock run at 1,731 hours. His uniform was coated in dust. His arms shook from exertion. Yet he was uninjured. His team was intact. Officers met him with urgent relief. The third success in a single day confirmed the viability of terrain-based infiltration. It proved that even against reinforced defenses, subtle earth patterns could shape victory. As night approached, soldiers spoke of nothing else. The collapse of the bunker node triggered a rapid German withdrawal across the western taxiway. Machine gun crews abandoned secondary fighting positions and fell back toward the inner airfield perimeter. Mortar teams lost their coordination. Their rounds landed without pattern, a sign that their observers had either been cut off or forced to change vantage points under pressure. Allied units pushed forward cautiously. Engineers cleared wire. Rifle squads advanced through crater fields with tight spacing. The brigade commander viewed the unfolding situation and recognized the rare advantage. The German line, once rigid, had fractured along an axis they never anticipated. Terrain had defeated fortification. Elias stood at the edge of the livestock run and watched the assault teams move. He felt the exhaustion in his arms and shoulders from the crawl. His uniform carried the weight of dust, soil, and dried sweat. Yet his mind stayed alert. He mapped every new contour around him. He saw where artillery had reshaped the earth during the last exchange. He saw where depressions deepened and where fresh craters created forced gaps. Even in victory, the land continued to shift. War never let the ground stay still. At 18:15 hours, the battalion commander gathered Elias and several officers near a burned-out tractor that served as a temporary cover point. They reviewed the results of the 3 assaults. Each breach had depended on precise timing, terrain reading, and controlled movement. Each succeeded with minimal casualties. The commander stated that the brigade was preparing a full report to higher headquarters. He wanted detailed descriptions of the trough, the drainage path, and the livestock run. He asked Elias to provide his measurements and observations. Elias handed him the reconnaissance notes. The commander scanned them and immediately noticed the clarity. He saw slope descriptions, soil density estimates, shadow behavior timestamps, and visibility ranges. These were not ordinary infantry notes. They reflected a different way of thinking. While officers discussed the next objectives, German counterfire resumed. Artillery shells fell across the captured taxiway. Allied units took cover behind wreckage. Elias moved with the scouts toward a crater rim. He studied how the incoming fire struck the ground. He predicted where new depressions might form. He told the scouts to mark positions after each barrage. The scouts followed his direction without hesitation. They had learned that reading the ground could save lives. By 19:30 hours, the brigade secured a stable perimeter on the western side of the airfield. Command prepared for a limited night operation. Patrols pushed into the interior hangar zone. Machine gun crews established overlapping fields of fire. Engineers mapped potential routes for armor. The brigade liaison approached Elias again. He said that higher command intended to incorporate the terrain-based infiltration concept into formal training modules. He asked Elias to explain his decision-making process once more. Elias repeated the same points. He said he read the land the way he once read irrigation lines. He said depressions carried information. He said water patterns reveal the truth. The liaison wrote everything down. At 20:45 hours, a formal commendation note circulated through the battalion. It recognized the actions of Elias's team and emphasized the strategic value of their innovation. It stated that civilian experience could inform battlefield tactics in unexpected ways. Officers read the document and acknowledged its implications. Wars are often shaped by doctrine. Yet doctrine often fails when terrain defies expectation. The commanders realized that victory required not only strength and firepower but also ingenuity. Elias sat with Hensley and Reese behind a crater lip as patrols moved through the taxiway. They ate ration biscuits and drank from their canteens. They spoke little. The day had drained them. Hensley asked Elias how he recognized the livestock run so quickly. Elias said he saw the soil pattern. Reese asked what he meant. Elias pointed to the compact edges where hoof traffic had pressed the earth. He pointed to the shallow center where water once flowed after rain. Reese nodded slowly. He began scanning the land with new understanding. Their quiet exchange marked a shift. Soldiers who once dismissed subtle terrain now studied it with care. As night deepened, German resistance inside the airfield stiffened. Machine guns fired from hangar entrances. Snipers took positions in control tower ruins. Mortar fire increased. Allied officers planned a new push at dawn. They asked Elias whether any usable depressions led toward the hangar complex. He said that depressions existed but none provided a continuous line. The airfield interior had been flattened during construction. It was open ground. Approaches would rely on smoke, armor, and suppressive fire. Terrain alone would not solve this phase. Officers appreciated the honesty. They understood that no tactic worked everywhere. The battalion rotated Elias to a rear position for the night. Medics inspected him. His elbows were bruised from repeated crawling. His knees were scraped. His uniform sleeves were torn. He refused rest until he completed his notes. He documented each infiltration route. He included soil data, depth changes, and timing conditions. He wrote without embellishment. He wanted the record to be useful, not dramatic. When he finished, he handed the notes to the adjutant. The adjutant said they would be forwarded to brigade headquarters immediately. Near midnight, the artillery quieted. Scouts returned from the hangar perimeter with new intelligence. The airfield interior would be heavily contested. Officers shifted their planning accordingly. They incorporated armored support and air bursts to suppress fortified points. Elias listened to the discussions but remained silent. His role for the day was complete. He had done what he could with the land. He did not seek attention. He did not seek recognition. He wanted the assaults to succeed. He wanted fewer names added to the casualty rolls. When dawn touched the horizon again, the brigade launched the next phase. Tanks rolled forward. Infantry advanced behind armored cover. Engineers cleared mines. German defenders fought with intensity but lacked cohesion. The earlier bunkers that anchored their defense were gone. Their lines had been forced to realign around broken geometry. Their confidence had eroded. Allied forces pressed through hangars, fuel depots, and concrete shelters. By midday, the airfield fell. Word of Elias's contributions spread beyond the battalion. Officers from adjacent units visited to learn how he identified depressions. They asked him to brief their reconnaissance teams. He explained the same points again. He repeated them with calm clarity. Some understood quickly. Others struggled. Yet all appreciated the logic. In the aftermath of the battle, official reports credited multiple units for the success. They noted the value of artillery, armor, and coordinated infantry assault. They mentioned demolition teams that breached bunkers. They recognized the importance of reconnaissance. A few lines acknowledged the unexpected factor. A private with farming experience had read the ground in ways that standard training overlooked. Elias received a field commendation that month. His officers praised his courage and insight. His fellow soldiers shook his hand. He accepted their respect quietly. He did not celebrate. He returned to his duties. He continued reading terrain. He continued guiding scouts. War demanded consistency. Innovation mattered only when repeated. Years later, after the war ended, Elias returned to the Netherlands. He worked land again. He rebuilt irrigation lines. He restored fields that had survived the war's passage. He spoke little of Carpiquet. He mentioned only that sometimes the smallest details decide the largest outcomes. The reports archived in military records noted the Trough, the drainage path and the livestock run as examples of terrain-based infiltration. His name appeared briefly, then faded among thousands of others. Yet within the battalion, those who survived remembered him. They remembered the farmer who saw what others missed. They remembered how 3 shallow depressions changed the course of a fortified battle. They remembered that knowledge could be as powerful as firepower. They remembered that survival often depended on looking closer at the earth beneath their feet. Elias had never wanted fame. He wanted clarity. He wanted understanding. He wanted to see the land as it was. He achieved that. His legacy lived in the ground he once read with instinct sharpened by necessity.